Hi, how's everybody doing this morning? Good? Okay. There was a bit of rowdy stuff going on at the pool last night. Just saying. Um, so I'm I'm Dr. Andy Danilchuk, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote for today, Dr. Stephen Cooke. I think he almost sometimes doesn't even need an introduction. He's such a leader in our field, in our discipline of recreational fisheries science, but then beyond that. He's an expert and a leader in stress physiology, movement ecology, evidence synthesis. The testament to his leadership and expertise, his publication record, I think he's at over 1,300 publications, which is impressive. But I think what also is tied to that is his drive for collaboration and mentorship of not only his students, but also many of us in this audience, which is incredibly impressive. Um, he's really trained a lot of the next generation of those of us in this room, the next leaders in recreational fisheries science. He's been recognized in so many different ways in terms of his academic prowess, most cited by Clarivate. I forget what year was that in terms of his publications. But then he also gets awards beyond that in terms of the application of the science. Most recently elected to the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. The list goes on, and this is just a short copy of his CV. Um, and most recently, he was appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada to be a commissioner for the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, which is a huge testament to his expertise and leadership, very broadly. The last thing I do want to say, because I don't want to take up all this time, but what really helps, I think, us as a discipline is that Steve is also a human being. He's super grounded, he's fun to hang out with, he's supportive, and he's super kind. And I've been proud to have known Steve for a very long time. So with that, I just want to welcome Dr. Stephen Cooke.
All right. Wow. Yeah. Normally, I'm not nervous when I stand up in front of crowds. This time I am, and I think there's a couple reasons for it. So first off, wow, Valerio and Nelly knocked it out of the park. Those were truly outstanding plenaries. Okay, for new folks in the room, early career folks, that was a treat. Those were fantastic. So a tough series of acts to follow. The other thing is, as Andy mentioned, I play in different domains, the telemetry space and evidence synthesis space, but you're my people. Rec fishing is really central, sort of my passion. If I had enough money, it's probably all I would study. But such is life, get pulled in other directions. So really quite an honor to be here. Really thankful for the organizers. It's just been an impressive gathering to bring our community together. So big thanks for that. So today I'm going to provide a presentation that's based on my perspective. I'm going to talk about things that get me pessimistic and things that get me optimistic. We all live in different places, different lived experiences. So perhaps if you were standing up here, what you're optimistic about would be different than what I'm optimistic about, and so on. This is really meant to be a conversation starter. So there's things here that might resonate more in certain parts of the world than in others. That's very intentional. I've tried to identify where those things lay. So why pessimism? Why optimism? I don't know. I start my day with the news, and there's a lot to be sort of pessimistic or down about these days, from military conflicts to sort of the upheaval in global governance, funding challenges, I don't know, just generally people being unkind to each other. And so there's certainly a lot of pessimism, but you can't hang out in that hole too long or things get dark. So then there's all the things that we have to be happy about and optimistic about and hope for change. So that's sort of the inspiration for the talk today. I want to break down a few things. I want to start off with this last part of my title, through the lens of a scholar practitioner and angler. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with the fishing because that's where it started for me. We've heard different sort of paths, and there is no single path to get here. For me, like Nellie, it also started with TV, except I was watching Bob Azumi, who is a fishing personality in Canada. Every Saturday morning, most kids are watching cartoons. I was taken in fishing shows. Pretty avid angler. Figured out, wow, one might be able to make a career of this. Of course, I was going to be a local fisheries manager before I got the research itch. Ended up doing my PhD with Dave Phillip, who's in the room. You can kind of make of that what you will. You could suggest that I need constant lifelong mentoring, and so Dave follows me around, or maybe it's flipped around and I need to take care of Dave. So you can figure out where things lay. I'm also a father of 3 boys, and that helps to certainly helps to define me. And I'm somebody, and I think like many of you, there's this blurry line between our professional lives and our personal lives because we love what we do. If we're given time off, I'm going to pick up a fishing rod and go fishing and spend time with my family. I think in our family, this really became evident during the pandemic where, our bubble was our family, and I couldn't help but continue to do research. So they became my assistants, and there they are doing some data entry, help design this particular study. They did not do the statistical analysis, just to be very clear, and it was featured on our national science news radio program. I'm also a tackle shop owner twice, 2 times over. Once at Carleton University, I've got a tackle shop in the basement there, and then my basement at home. But it's sort of it's a poor inventory model. The inventory comes in and never goes out. So it's really just the purchasing side of things. So yeah, very, I'm part of the industry. I help to keep it afloat, that's for sure. So yeah, and join the professoriate. I call myself a scholar practitioner. That's a term that might be unfamiliar to some of you. It's the idea that work on practical things, and oftentimes I do find myself at tables providing science advice, and more recently, as Andy mentioned, as a commissioner, even making decisions. So I do wear that dual hat. So hence scholar practitioner, and as a rec fisher. I think that's the case for many of us, but not all of us, and there's no requirement that you have to be a rec fisher to be part of our community. It just happens to be a path that many of us have taken. I think it provides some perspective. I know that when I walk into a room that's full of anglers and I'm talking to the angling community, I'm part of that community instead of somebody coming from the ivory tower with sort of a disconnected worldview and trying to impose something on them. I'm part of that community. That also allows me to be critical of the community, okay? Because I'm part of it. So I just want to share that, and there's things that I'll be a little critical of today. It does create some really interesting tensions at times, and I know Robert and I have had to deal with this. We dabble in the fish welfare space, and sometimes we're called out in our papers for not recognizing the massive amounts of funding that we get from the recreational fishing sector. Sadly, it's not massive amounts. But that conflict of interest is something that sort of, alters our view in a negative way and biases us. Things to consider. Here's just a few pictures of folks in the room that really walk that line. And it doesn't have to be with a fishing rod. It could be with a spear gun. I do want to point out there's only one person up there that doesn't actually have a fish. They're just wearing dress clothes and standing there with a fishing rod. So there's some real anglers and there's some posers. So just want to be clear about that. So let's go back to the first part of the talk. So that's essentially my positionality. That's what I've just shared with you. What I want to talk now is about this pessimism and optimism. In terms of pessimism, and you can, there's sort of glass half empty, glass half full. You can sort of, think about what this means to you. But there's some benefits that come from pessimism. It allows us to be critical, think about the risks that are around us, be cognizant of errors, and it forces us to pay attention to the unintended consequences of different actions. And without pessimism, optimism really can become this overconfidence where we know all and we'll just do it and all is good. So there's some benefit that comes from it as well. And then in complex systems, and I would argue many of our recreational fishing systems are complex socio-ecological systems, pessimism can act as a stabilizing force, and it can identify some of those vulnerabilities before things get catastrophic. On the other hand, optimism, it's sort of a motivating, inspiring, creative, this idea of forward momentum, encourages people and institutions to really take on difficult tasks and challenges and invest in long-term projects, which is something that I think is valuable. And then without optimism, risk-taking collapses. You just sort of do the comfortable thing. Innovation slows, and systems become more defensive and stagnant. Okay, so again, they're concepts that I think all of us embrace optimism, pessimism throughout our day in various ways. It's not like we sit back and muse about what those terms actually mean. So hopefully that was helpful just to orient you. And there's a tension between these two, and some scholars have called this the idea that this yields something called productive realism, right? So you don't want to be so optimistic that just nothing makes sense. It's just you'll never be able to reconcile that optimism with reality, and so it creates this thing called productive realism, a mindset that combines ambition with some caution, hope with some scrutiny. And I think as scientists, and even if you're here and not formally here wearing a science hat, anglers are also scientists. You're gathering knowledge and making observations. We bring scrutiny to what we do. We reflect and we learn continuously. And it's important to realize these things don't cancel each other out. They're just two perspectives, and collectively they improve our judgment, decision making, and create some resilience. And I would argue it's that tension that really allows our rec fishery systems to persist, adapt, and evolve under this accelerating, global landscape of environmental and social change that we all deal with on a day-to-day basis. I also want to just orient everybody to sort of my worldview on what recreational fisheries should be, and that's both responsible and sustainable. And that's frankly just ripping off the UN FAO's wording that they use for all fisheries. It's just only in the last decade or so we've started to include recreational fisheries within that space as well. I love the use of the word responsible because it implies that everybody that's involved in the sector is part of it, and responsibility exists at the level of the individual all the way up to the organization. At the end of the day, we're working towards something that's sustainable, so it involves anglers, the industry, decision makers. You don't see scientists up there. We're in the shadows, right? Scientists are sort of in the shadows, feeding information into that ecosystem. And this is a very simplified example of what a sustainable, responsible and sustainable recreational fishery is. Obviously, there's other elements in there when we talk about socioeconomics. There's the culture. We need to think about ethical and inclusive fisheries and so on. But just wanted to get you thinking towards that. So when I talk about pessimism and optimism, it's in the context of trying to get there. All right, so what I'm going to do for the next 10 or 15 slides is work through a series of things that get me pessimistic, so these so-called sources of pessimism, and then things that get me optimistic, okay? Each one is a slide or two, and I'll make it clear when I transition from pessimism to optimism. So the first thing that I'm pessimistic about is our ability to maintain the social license, okay? The social license is the idea that the broader public society accepts recreational fishing as a legitimate activity. And the reality is we're seeing that social license eroded in a number of places. It's easy to point at the animal welfare movement as a thing, as being a driver. It's involved, but a big part of that is the general disconnection of people with nature. More people are living in urban centers. More people are spending less time outdoors, or if they're outdoors, they're in a manicured, green space surrounded by tall buildings, and there's no places to fish. So I think we're going to see more public scrutiny, and I think we're going to have to work really, really hard to try and maintain the social license. And I think we're also going to see more and more of these conflicts, both within the sector and between the sector and other entities. So that certainly has me concerned. If you want to read more about it, Rachel Kelly, who's an amazing interdisciplinary scholar, has written about the social license in the marine sector. It's not specific to rec fisheries, but there's things you can take from that in your thinking and apply it to your work. The next is technology. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how technology can be used for good, but technology can also be problematic. Right now, we're seeing the rapid production and embrace of new technologies, and frankly, the management folks can't keep up. You know, this is capitalism. This is how things work. This is innovation. It goes back to everything from braided fishing line to what used to be just depth finders, which are now forward-facing sonar or live sonar. Drones that can now take, you can go down surf fishing instead of being able to cast. What was the longest cast was 220 or 240 meters or something like that. You can take it down a kilometer, drop your bait, and access water that we couldn't, that previously was unfishable. There's no place for fish to hide now, frankly, with some of the live sonar technology. There's lures you can buy that flash and vibrate and stink and all those things. So collectively, these are things that we need to consider. And if we look at what's gone on, the way things work, so this is sort of this innovation adoption life cycle. So here are the innovators, the people that are the first ones to purchase or apply a technology, and then eventually the masses come on board, the majority, and then you've got the laggards on the far end. So that's just, could be a new hook type, could be anything. It doesn't have to be in the rec fish space at all, but that's a well-accepted pattern of adoption. And what we tend to do in the rec fishing space and the management space is to be reactive. So we don't pay attention until everybody has adopted it. And at that point, it's almost too late. You can't start, if you start to smack on regulations, then people get upset because it's become ingrained within the sector. What we really need to be doing is helping the management community be more proactive. So on the front end, doing some horizon scanning, thinking about the technologies that are coming at us, thinking about what the threats and opportunities are associated with those, and altering or developing appropriate management as needed. So this is essentially a call. It's not just about the tech. It's the need to be more proactive with our thinking and management about it. I will also add that not all of these things are the domain of fishery scientists. Some of these are societal decisions and go back to the social license. What does the average citizen think about using technology in the ways we now are to exploit fish populations? You can see that potentially contributing to challenges in maintaining the social license. All right, the next is the continued failure to incorporate evolutionary principles into rec fish management, despite all sorts of science suggesting that's important. If I didn't include this one, Dave would have gotten mad at me. So, and we've seen one talk already on this idea of selective removal of fish and how that can change fish populations. There's another talk later today that Dave's delivering. And this isn't new, this idea. We can go back to Mary Ashley's important paper from 2003 called Evolutionarily Enlightened Management. And what's interesting is if you actually ask resource managers about this, so Carly Cooke did that in a survey, managers recognize the importance of evolutionary concepts as it relates to resource management, but they rarely incorporate them into those management activities. So there's some challenges, there's some training opportunities certainly there, and we need to help the management community develop toolboxes that have these kinds of protections and thinking built right in. The next is that climate change is not being taken seriously, okay? This is really a big one. At this conference, there are just from going through the abstract book, by my count, there are 5 climate change presentations, so thank you for those. We need more. We need more climate science. Those papers that tend to exist, not a criticism, just a reality, they tend to be problem focused. We're still pointing at problems. and less about what to do with it. So how do we change how we manage fisheries in the face of climate change? And that's where the real challenge is. There's obviously biology that needs to be done, but there's a whole bunch of human dimensions work to do as well. If we're going to be managing fisheries in different ways, if we're trying to alter individual behavior, we need to know what levers make sense. Um, Management agencies have been slow to adapt. Uh, we've we've been relying on something called autonomous adaptation, where individuals are making decisions out of necessity. So it doesn't make sense to go fishing late in the afternoon when it's hot in the depths of summer because you're not going to catch anything anyways. So that's good for the fish because you're not stressing them at those high temperatures. That's an example of one of those methods of adaptation. You have to travel farther, alter the targets, the species that you target. And there tends to be just this idea of, oh, it's too difficult to tackle, right? I'm not going to be able to knock the temperature down a couple degrees myself, so we just have to roll with it. We are going to have to roll with it, sadly, but we need to roll with it in an intelligent and purposeful way where we're planning around that, working with what's coming at us. There are some success stories out there, and I should say that's the case with everything that I'm pessimistic about. There's always a little bit of a glimmer of hope in all of these. We're seeing the implementation of what are called hoot owl restrictions, so where people don't fish between, say, mid-afternoon and midnight when water temperatures are warmest. A lot of salmonid-oriented organizations are embracing that. We've seen the development of water thermometers on when to fish and not. Sometimes these things are regulated, but most often these are just voluntary actions. All right, the next is a we know best mentality rather than embracing evidence. And I'm going to give you an example. The first one is for anglers. The next one's going to be for managers, okay? So the first is this notion that pouring carbonated beverages, another pop, soda, whatever you call it, cola, over the gills of fish will stop the bleeding magically, okay? And so there's a lot of social media lore on this. There's magazine articles and so on. So we did the first study and only study on this topic. We used northern pike as a model. We intentionally and purposefully injured the fish gills in a standardized way. We applied a variety of substances. Mountain Dew is very popular, so we tried that. We carbonated lake water as one of our interesting controls to try and tease out what was going on. And after we did that, we put the fish in a white cooler, and it was remarkable. You saw no blood for about the first 20 seconds. And this harkens back to some of my PhD work. I was working on fish cardiovascular physiology in another life, and the fish were going into severe bradycardia. So you pour a noxious substance over their gills, and it's like they're holding their breath. That's a simplification. But bradycardia means the heart stops. And so basically they just freeze. They're trying to protect themselves. And when that happens, there's just no blood flow, right? Everything's just seizes. And as soon as you give them time, so after about 20 seconds, you see one puff of blood. And then after about 10 seconds, you see two puffs of blood. And then 5 seconds, and all of a sudden it ramps up as the heart starts going. So it gives the illusion these fish have stopped bleeding. But really, once their heart starts pushing again, they start bleeding. So they bleed out after they've swam away from your boat. So again, something that gives the illusion of working, but doesn't. So we found no evidence of any benefit. You're just wasting your Coke and providing an unpleasant experience to these animals. But this gentleman, he's a local fishing guide. He's the one that pushed us to do this work. He funded half of the work. And afterwards, when we worked with the local newspaper to talk about our findings, he said, I'm going to continue to do it because I'm pretty sure it does work. So, it was just sort of one of those like head shaking moments. So, yeah. The same thing plays out in the management space. So that might look like trash to you. I think it is. That is being thrown in water bodies. And those are Georgia Department of Natural Resources officials that are doing that. Okay, so we have a government agency, a natural resource agency that thinks that plastic is appropriate fish habitat. On the same token, Georgia also has an environmental conservation department that's trying to address microplastic pollutions in the environment. So, this is something where there's not a lot of science on it. I've mused, raged about it in this paper here. This is a bunch of Boy Scouts that are being trained to do habitat restoration by adding plastic to the environment. Where does it stop? Let's, dump all of our used vehicles in there as well. There's some learnings here that can come from the marine world. Remember when we were throwing all of our tires in the ocean to create reefs? Well, we're now pulling all of those reefs out because we realize that they leach, they degrade, and that they're not a great idea. So this is something where, we know best, this is good for fish, but it's not long-term thinking. It's a short-term Band-Aid fish aggregator, and that's of no benefit to anglers in the long term, nor our fish populations or aquatic ecosystems. The next is a reluctance to embrace effort controls in recreational fisheries management, okay? We focus on harvest controls. So, how do we prevent the overharvest of fish? We use bag limits and so on. And this isn't a new topic. I'm not the first one to stand up here and say this. So Sean Cox, Doug Beard, and Carl Walters wrote a really great paper that makes a passionate plea for embracing these types of things. But it's difficult. The rec fishing community always considers effort controls to be an attack on opportunity. We're going to lose fishing opportunities, and therefore, even if it works, we're going to fight against it vehemently because we don't want to give an inch. Scholar practitioners avoid it because they know it's going to create conflict. So this is something that I think there's a lot of learnings that could come from parts of Europe where they have limited entry fisheries. There's certainly in the marine space, marine protected areas essentially accomplish this same thing, are used more commonly than they are in freshwater. I do want to note, as we go down this path, and I think we will need to, we do need to make sure that we're still ensuring equitable access, that it's not those with more money that can access these sites, that it's not those that are more catch and release oriented, or whatever the case may be. We need to make sure that these serve the broader recreational fishing community. The next is the inability to look at fishing and fishers through diverse lenses and create a safe and inclusive space. We're seeing lots of conflict within. Back in the day, it used to be rec fishing versus commercial fishing, and that's where the conflict is. We are as divided as a community, probably more divided than we are, relative to those intersectoral conflicts. This is a silly example, but just the other day, a man in Ontario, where I live, was charged with assault because somebody was ice fishing too close to him. So just absolutely ridiculous, but that's the kind, that certainly doesn't help with the social license. But yeah, just one example there. But there's also systemic issues, in particular related to racism and misogyny, that contribute to exclusion. Another bad example here from Ontario, where I live, they actually had to do a Human Rights Commission tribunal because there were Asian Canadian anglers that were being assaulted. They were termed the White Bucket Brigade because they were more harvest oriented and they would remove fish in buckets. And they were being assaulted regularly by people that thought those fish should be released. So, and that was deemed as a human rights violation. And then from the misogynistic perspective, and you only have to go on social media and have a pretty shallow look to find many examples. This is Alyssa Goodenough. She was a master's student with Vivian, Andy, and I, and she did a very brave, courageous thesis focused on understanding these issues. She interviewed 40 women anglers in Ontario and heard of horrendous stories that were really quite troubling. And so there's a lot of opportunity there for change, reform, for allyship, and so on, to make fishing open and accessible to all in a safe, welcoming way. This last one here, why do fish bite? It's the gazillion-dollar question. If one person in this room could figure this out, they of course would win the tournament and all the glory that comes with it. We wondered if we could figure this out from the literature. So we assembled over 300 papers, and this included commercially oriented papers that involve catching fish on hooks as well. So we wanted to get the broadest body of literature there. And we went all through those and we found two things that mattered, okay? One was that hunger increases the probability of a fish being vulnerable. Is that going to help you? Not so much. And the second, encounter is necessary yet often insufficient condition for capture, okay? So your lure needs to actually be near the fish. If that doesn't happen, then you're definitely not going to catch something, okay? So there's nothing there you can really operationalize as an angler. I'm going to be pessimistic about our ability to solve this. Fish continue to be mysterious beasts. I think that's what draws us into fishing, as Robert has discussed in one of his presentations here at the meeting. We fish because of the mystery in some cases, not the reliability of catching fish. That said, if we do figure this out, I'm going to make a lot of money. So you're going to need to buy Dr. Stevens' magic worm. So 300% more aquatic quantum energy. So yeah. All right. Let's switch to the optimism side, okay? So things I'm pessimistic about, really opportunities if you think about it. They're opportunities that we can tackle and hopefully discuss in a more fulsome way next time we gather. But here's things that I'm optimistic about. And I should also say, none of these are perfect, okay? It's not like, I'm optimistic about this, we've solved it, we can move on. It's just we're seeing things move in what I would call the right direction here. All right? The first is that anglers are engaging in meaningful ways that demonstrate a commitment to responsible and sustainable fisheries. And I think the key here is that individuals matter. The individual anglers play a huge role as they interact with that individual fish, okay? That's what a recreational fishing experience involves. There are a number of organizations that sort of have that concept baked into their DNA. The Keep Fish Wet movement has an advocate program, tries to instill those values in folks, ensuring that they're handling fish in the best possible way. Sean and the Tuna Champions movement, very similar, just more species focused. And it's really about these actions of individuals and how they aggregate in a good way to have benefits that really scale up, to have population level benefits that benefit other anglers and so on. The challenge really is how to engage the masses. How do we move from the 6 anglers in a room of 100 that step up and do this to getting all of them to do it? We're starting to see some more science in that space. Megan Guckian did a really cool paper looking at sanctioning on the riverbank. And just to be clear, this isn't vigilantism. She didn't go up with a crowbar and trying to threaten people. It's just giving people nudges. Hey, I saw you land that steelhead and, you might have dragged it up on the rocks. I heard that that's not great for fish. Next time you catch one, do you want me to help you? I'd love to show you how I handle them, and I think it might be better off. And that person might say, screw off, I'm not interested, but hopefully that opens a pathway for discussion and leads to behavioral change. So that's just one example, sanctioning, nudging. There's a lot of interesting work happening in that space, not necessarily in the recreational fishing sphere, but elsewhere, and I think we can learn from that. All right, and the next is the gap between science and action has been narrowed, okay? And Vivian Nguyen, who's in the room, is an expert in in the idea of knowledge mobilization, understanding the knowledge action gap or the science action gap, and this is well understood. This really comes down to the healthcare space, the idea that we had lots of science that said, hey, this would be better for human health or would lead to better medical outcomes, yet it didn't end up in practice. It didn't end up in the hands of physicians and so on. And so we've done a lot of work as a community to figure out how to narrow that gap, bring the science to the table in ways that decision makers will actually embrace it and use it. I'm just going to give an example here from some work that we did in partnership with Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, led by Jake Brownscombe. And so this was with Permit in Florida, a telemetry study, and they were looking at the timing of fish aggregating at these offshore sites where they could be easily harvested, easily caught, easily harvested. And so there was already a harvest prohibition in place from May, June, and July. And through telemetry work, we figured out very quickly that, in fact, they're arriving early. And so suggestion was we need to change the dates. We need to close the fishery about a month earlier. And that happened, and it happened very quickly, okay? So quickly that one of the social scientists that we work with, Nathan Young, said, you have to write about that. That really is quite unique. So what happened there? How did that happen so quickly? So first of all, Bonefish and Tarpon Trust is very connected, has a lobbying arm, well-respected aggregator of science, knows how to bring it to decision makers in usable ways. The decision makers were interested in trying to do a better job of managing and protecting these very valuable fisheries, and the fishing guides were very supportive, okay, who were a key stakeholder group here. They were supportive because these fish were getting harvested and exploited in ways that affected their livelihoods in the long term. A big part of this is trust and legitimacy. So if it was just some random folks doing this study, it would take much longer. The legitimacy that having it done through BTT in partnership with fishing guides was really the special sauce for having that science move into practice as quickly as it did. And again, that's still unique, that speed that we saw there. But if you want to do this, it's about co-production. That's where we're seeing the real pay dirt in closing that gap between science and management, science and practice. Co-production means working together from the beginning. What are the questions that we think are important and that we want to tackle together, and continuing to work collaboratively through the entire process. Don't have much more time to get into it than that, but if you haven't heard that term, I really encourage you to dig in. There's some really accessible literature there to get up on the topic. The next, rec fisheries are diversifying as a result of concerted efforts, and we're starting to think and look at rec fishing differently at the very early stages. I know you might look at this and say, wow, doesn't that just counter with that other one you showed me about racism and sexism and so on? So this is one where there's some good and the bad sort of happening simultaneously. So and a lot of this is being been reflected in some of our great presentations. So Vivian did a great series of presentations yesterday on this concept of provisioning fisheries, that there are individuals, oftentimes in low-income urban communities, often immigrants, that depend heavily on fish that are caught under the auspices of rec fishing license for food, for nutrition. And is that really a rec fishery? Is that substance fishery? So Vivian's brought this concept of provisioning fisheries to the fore. Yesterday, Nellie was telling us about the ways in which rec fishing is uplifting communities off the eastern coast of Africa. And so there are some bright spots here. We're seeing some early stages of success, but there's a lot more to do here. And yesterday, Vivian challenged us with trying to figure out how to take this idea that, wow, people really do fish for lots of reasons, and making sure that that's reflected in our management actions. And I think that's where there's still a lot of opportunity for development. The next, it's been working well. The next is that rec fisheries are being used to create socioeconomic opportunities in emerging economies, LMICs, that benefit locals over the long term, okay? Here's 3 examples. There are others out there. We've got Mazir in Bhutan. We've got GT in Alphonse area, and then we've got Arapaima in Guyana. You can see the various some of the key players involved there. But in each of these instances, there is also science happening. So it's not just we're going to uplift the community, give everybody a fishing guide license or fishing rods and walk away and hope that we've done good. There's also science happening to figure out things like carrying capacity. How many fishers can be sustained in a given fishery? Is catch and release compatible with as Andy was talking about yesterday, the notion of a blue economy. And so there has been science done on all of these systems to try and support the development of, again, a responsible, sustainable, and ethical fishery that really uplifts locals. The next one, so we're back to technology again, but this is different. This is techno-science, okay? This is the idea that it's the technology that we can use as scientists and managers to do our job better. This isn't about anglers doing a better job of exploiting fish. This is a hypothetical dashboard, Can you imagine the fisheries manager of the future sitting at their desk? I do hope they still get to go in the field, but sitting at their desk and having something like this, where there's real-time data feeds coming in from the latest eDNA survey that was done yesterday. You know, you sent out drones that collected water samples that brought them back and didn't tell you just what was there, but were actually able to tell you about abundance. We're getting better at that. That's not far-fetched. We're monitoring environmental conditions in more or less real time. We're monitoring the positions of fish in more or less real time. We have anglers on the landscape that are catching fish, taking pictures, feeding that into their apps. Christian, Paul Venturelli, and others have done a lot of work in that space. Again, that coming back to the desk of the fisheries manager, drones, underwater submersibles, all these new forms of technology, all feeding information to the fisheries manager. Now they're going to be overwhelmed, okay? No doubt about it. So the real challenge there is to how to take that, aggregate it. It's going to require use of machine learning, AI, and have that feed into a series of levers that they can essentially pull from their desk. And you could also see the opportunity for them to push out things as well. Well, we think we want to do this regulation change. What does the community think about that? And you send out some form of survey instrument. It then gets you information on the social acceptability of that proposed regulatory change. So I do think we're going to be able to move to a point where we can be more real time with our management. There's a whole bunch of challenges and we're still a ways off from this, but I do think that's the wave of the future. That should allow us to stay on top of things and be more proactive than reactive. We're creating space for community science and more participatory collaborative management. Everything from goal setting through to scenario planning and actual management. There's examples from around the world. I'm of course most familiar with the ones from Canada. Here's a great paper on how this played out. This used a scenario planning approach. Martin gave a great talk yesterday on how this plays out in British Columbia through their sport fish advisory boards. I'm most familiar with the Ontario context where they have fisheries management zone councils. They don't just have anglers on them, they also have bait fish operators, tourism outfitters, the local commercial fishers, the Turtle Lover Association, all sorts of different groups represented at the table, and it leads to really, really interesting conversations, but most importantly, it leads to relationship building, so that you start to understand the perspective of others, work collaboratively to find a path forward, and even at the end of the day, if you don't like the decision that the group makes, you understand how they got there. There's transparency, and you were at the table as a representative, as a voice, and you can take that back to your community and say, it's a tough decision that we have to do that, but here's why. So this is really where things are moving. It's part of sort of the democratization of science and decision making, and it's, I think, a really good thing. The next is that rec fishers are being taken seriously by politicians and decision makers. I think underpinning this is that we've done a really good job, thanks to our economist friends. I'm not sure we have that many of them here this time, but our economist friends in particular have done a great job of aggregating the value of our fisheries, okay? The Great Lakes Fishery Commission, Bonefish and Tarpon Trust invest every few years in socioeconomic studies because that is the lever to go to politicians and say, these fisheries matter and here's the value of them. It's impossible for politicians to ignore when you start to look at the economic value. And that's just the surface. When we start to think about provisioning fisheries, the food that comes from those, the mental health benefits and wellness benefits that come from fishing and so on, there's really immense values that come from rec fishing. I want to give you an example. A couple months ago, there was a suggestion in the US that there would be massive cuts to the science and management infrastructure on the Laurentian Great Lakes on the US side. And what came from that was incredible bipartisan support for continuing to fund the Great Lakes science. And in fact, there's the news headline that came from that. The federal funding was authorized for the Great Lakes Science Center, which was previously slated for mothballing. And it's because of that value, the value proposition. The Great Lakes recreational fishery is worth $5.5 billion. So those several $1 million to do the science and assessment work so we can make good management decisions is pennies. It's an incredible return on investment. Okay, those are the kinds of narratives that we've been doing a good stories we've been doing a good job telling. It takes work. Here's Julie with the past executive director and current executive director of the American Fisheries Society. She's on Capitol Hill. That's, you probably can't read it. She's the plaque there happens to be for Bernie Sanders' office. But they were door knocking, visiting with staffers and congresspeople and senators to have discussions about the importance of fish and fisheries and aquatic ecosystems. There are entities such as the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation in the US that do that kind of work as well. And then globally, we're starting to see organizations like the UNFAO start to think about bringing rec fishing into that broader conversation about fisheries. That started a bit more than a decade ago, and I think has advanced in a good way. This is a big one. The next generation of scholar practitioners and rec fishers are stepping up and being welcomed into our community. I was mentioning earlier about some of the issues with live sonar. Here's a fishing tournament that's organized by the local college and high school fishers, and what have they done? No forward-facing sonar. So I have some hope for the future. This is an NGO that was created by a teenager trying to help youth connect with nature. We've got the Rec Fish West example of this Next Wave Young Future Leaders program centered around rec fishing. And at this conference, we have the Australian delegation. Hands up, where are the Australian delegation? Okay. Many of them early career folks that are here being mentored, interacting with professionals from around the world, again, preparing that next generation. So that's something that really gives me a lot of optimism. Rec fisheries science is developing into a respected body of scholarship and shows signs of maturation as a community of practice, okay? This is something I don't think we could have said a decade or two ago. This rec fisheries management school is brilliant, you know, as a way to share what many of us know with the masses. Obviously, the conference venue is part of that, and the World Rec Fisheries community that's come from that has sort of underpinned much of this. This book, you know, a really, really important contribution. It's a must read, frankly, for everybody in the room. You know, books don't come early in the development of a discipline. They come when things are really starting to mature, and that's just but one example. And then finally, the World Fisheries Congress. I remember some of the, and I think Dave and Julie were at the first one in Athens, if I'm not mistaken. Rec fishing was just not on the agenda. It was all about commercial fisheries by and large, and aquaculture. Now there are numerous sessions on rec fisheries. That was the case at Seattle. You had to make decisions about which room you would be in. That is new, and again shows a development. And again, this community of practice. You know, can email somebody on the other side of the planet and say, hey, I got a question. I've hit a roadblock here. I think you're dealing with a similar issue, and people will share generously, okay? That's an example of the maturation of our community. I think something that's really exciting. All right, I think this is the last one, and this is that there are success stories, okay? There are a lot of them, and if you look through the agenda, you will see many, many examples. Some of them are complete successes, some of them are partial successes, some are little, some are big, some are very local, some are more global, but they're successes, and that really matters. When we find something that works, we need to share it with people that will listen, that can learn, that can potentially bring it to the table in their specific context. Not everything is transferable, okay, for a variety of reasons, but it's an opportunity to learn, to change. And to upscale, right? So what worked here, can we upscale it and use that somewhere else? I also want to point out that failures are equally good as long as we learn from them, okay? If we just fail and move on, that's a problem. If we fail and learn, that's a win, okay? But we also have to share our failures. And so I would love to see more candid presentations that talk about your failures. Nobody likes to do that. But if you take a moment and reflect, I learn more from my failures than my successes. And I think we all do. We're just nervous or hesitant to share them publicly. In terms of doing this idea of sharing what works, I just want to point out one of my academic heroes, Elena Bennett, a professor at McGill University in Montreal. She's got a TED talk called The Recipe for a Good Anthropocene, and in it she talks about her paper from 2017 in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment, where she introduces the concept of seeds of a good Anthropocene. Okay, seeds is analogous to bright spots. Okay, something that's good. And the idea with seeds is simple. You take something that's good, you plant it, you scale it up, the roots connect. And anyways, that's the analogy they used. But it's the idea that we have to share, and that's how and through individual action, that's how things will eventually scale up. So this is something I'm optimistic about, but it's also a plea for all of us to do a better job of sharing our successes and our failures. All right, so as I start to wrap up here, all of those things, in various ways feed into whether a fishery is going to be responsible or sustainable. And again, I would challenge all of you to sit back and think about the things you are pessimistic about, things that you're optimistic about, and as you do your work planning for this year, for future years, think about what you're going to do to try and address some of those challenges. What does AI think? I asked AI. I'm very new to this space. It suggests that conditional optimism is warranted with respect to the recreational fisheries sector. Most of the stuff's pretty blah and isn't informative. The bottom one here I really dislike, that management will become more crisis driven. I really hope that is wrong. Very wrong. So I hope that's something we can actively try and avoid by being proactive, by having good monitoring, by listening to the angling community, and by working collaboratively. Everything else up there is pretty high level and meaningless. Important, but meaningless. So, yeah. All right, so just going back to that tension, this idea of unchecked optimism. I'm so happy about it. We're going to do this. That's problematic as well, right? So there's this great tension between this sort of absurd level of optimism with being so dark and sort of despondent that you just disconnect and figure you can't do anything. So this unchecked optimism means that we underinvest, we delay intervention, we relax our regs, and we avoid making those tough decisions. And unchecked pessimism leads to disengagement, declining stewardship, political withdrawal, and so on. So there really is quite an interesting balance between these two. So something else to consider. So most of the optimism is still work that is unfinished, okay? And that's fine. Nobody solved any complex problems quickly, and things are always changing. Just when you thought you had the system figured out, something else changes. And I think that's our world, and will certainly be the world that the next generation have to deal with. Change is a theme that we've seen in a number of World Rec Fish conferences, and I don't think that theme is going to disappear anytime soon. We have to work together, that's obvious. And it's not just the people in this room, it's our broader communities and so on. It's going to take the coordinated and collective action of many. Here's some of the things that I think about that will help us to, if we can solve. These are questions that I would love to see us try and tackle at future meetings. How can we learn from the behavioral sciences about working together more effectively? How to create processes and structures that enable respectful collaborations and partnerships? How do we mobilize and activate the masses? There are so many rec fishers in the world. If Robert's correct, somewhere around 220 million. That's a lot of people that could do good for our fisheries and aquatic ecosystems and communities. So how do we activate and mobilize them? It's kind of like any professional society, right? You've got about 5 or 10% of people that are leaders and step up and are actively engaged, and everybody else just pays their membership and shows up. It's kind of like that with fishing. You show up, you buy your license, and you're a rec fisher. But if you look at the people that are in the clubs, that are leaders, that are really making change, it's a small proportion. We need to grow that, so that's normalized. Right? And then how do we exploit the tension between optimism and pessimism for the benefit of rec fisheries? So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and all the inspiration that you've given me over the years in my attendance at these events. Thank you.
So we'll take some. Is this on? Thank you, Steve, for an awesome plenary. Wasn't surprised. Time for some questions for Steve. And I think this works, right?
Criticisms are also welcome. Things you're optimistic or pessimistic about.
Great talk, Steve. So, interestingly, I saw a presentation on the same vein, like, what do we do next? And the punchline this person proposed was that we embrace uncertainty a little bit more. We start making decisions when they're less than 95% confident. Like, we feel pretty good about it. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Thanks for an easy one. The reality is that, as scientists, we thrive on uncertainty. We love uncertainty. It makes life interesting. Biology is about variation in life, right? But managers love certainty. They want to make decisions. They know if I do this, this will be the outcome, and great. And the reality is that that's not always the case. So, but the reality is they still need to make decisions. So rarely will there ever be perfect certainty. So yes, we do need to make decisions under uncertainty. The key there is transparency, I think, so that they're transparent about why the decision was made, how it was made, and a willingness to revisit it as the evidence base improves. The other thing is that, adaptive management gives us the opportunity to learn as we go. So instead of locking in and saying, okay, we've created the regulations and they're good for the next 30 years, they're locked in and we'll revisit them in 2060. Instead, this constant ongoing iterative process of learning, revising, and that I think is how to move forward in that space.
Robert, did you have your hand up first? You were like,
yeah. Thank you very much, Steve. Very inspiring. I'm a big fan, like you, of co-production, and I just want to share a story I noted in my environment to see what you think about it. Very often, we as scientists come towards a co-production setting when there's a problem, right? So it's like stocks are declining, what's going on? Then you assemble a team, you make your research, and it's often uncertain, which is the topic of the gentleman, right? You get an uncertain response about the causes of the problem and so on. And then decisions are made that often mean some regulatory constraint on the recreational fishing sector. So then you are kind of you're kind of made responsible for that regulatory decision, which then undermines future trust with the practitioners. How do we navigate that problem? That we cannot sustain co-production for a very long time because we are kind of seen responsible for constraints that come out of the corporation.
Yeah, and another easy one. Thanks, Robert. I think one of the ways to think about it is the idea that is that question formulation or problem identification, right? And if that can be done more collaboratively instead of it's the management agency that came up with the problem, or if we come together in a community, we all fish in this estuary. What do we collectively view as those priorities that we want to work towards? We recognize as an issue instead of it being we think this is the issue and we think that is the issue, and it's just too sort of singular issue oriented. So I think that's part of it, finding those things to work together on. The other thing is you can be very purposeful with co-production because again it goes back to trust and relationships. So you start with the easier stuff and you work towards the tougher stuff. And you do that through the relationship building. I'll go to the lower Fraser River in British Columbia, where there used to be incredible conflict between the indigenous cultural and economic opportunities fisheries, the rec fishers, and the commercial fish. And I'm not going to say it's perfect, but they found a common enemy now. It's the government, right? And so they are working together. They're at the same tables. They know each other. They socialize together. They eat together. They know about each other's families and share. And those relationships are what has been key to them being able to productively address some of the long-standing mistrust and conflict. So it's a long game. I think that's the other thing. As scientists, though, we really need to make sure we embrace the concept of being honest brokers, okay? We are not usually the decision makers or the arbiters. And our job is to be clear about what the evidence says and doesn't say, where those limitations are, and then sort of fade back into the background there. So another way is to bring in knowledge brokers or others that steer these processes, and that instead of the scientist being the central person, and we're in the background, and there's an intermediary that really is gifted in those kind of interactions that steers things. That costs money, but those are a few ideas on how to tackle that.
More time for more questions? Think, Jessica. The camera.
Yeah, thanks for the really interesting talk. It's my first time attending this conference, and so I don't know if I'm asking like the elephant in the room, but one thing I was surprised to not see was a mention of invasive species as recreational fisheries, and given the massive damage in South Africa and America and Canada and Australia, New Zealand, what is your optimistic take on the invasive fishes, as in some cases hundreds of years, is in the environmental destruction that we know they've caused, with the balance of this huge amount of money and interest and passion for recreational fisheries on invasive species?
Yeah, and this is a tough one because in many instances these were purposefully introduced to create recreational opportunities, oftentimes by natural resource management agencies. So yeah, and I think only now are we starting to reconcile with that. I can. The science isn't particularly, it's not a science question in many ways. It's more of a, I tell you my personal perspective. I prefer native species and native ranges. I don't want to come to South Africa to fish for largemouth bass. I want to fish for them in their native range. That said, it supports some local economic opportunities. It just does so with a cost. There's a cost to the ecosystem that's difficult to quantify, but it is a significant cost. So yeah, it's a tough one. The Great Lakes, the Laurentian Great Lakes are another example. Pacific salmon really are which are not endemic to the Great Lakes, were introduced to deal with a problem, and now there's an industry that's developed around it. And so the idea of stopping would be, hugely disruptive to the ecosystem. I think working on native fish restoration in the background is really helpful. That's one of the things they're doing in the Great Lakes. So you're rebuilding the lake trout populations, rebuilding the lake whitefish populations, and rebuilding the Atlantic salmon populations in the lakes where those respective species were and are not doing well now, creating those opportunities and eventually hoping that there'll be a switch and a transition back to those, I don't want to call them new opportunities, but they're opportunities that were lost and are just sort of being rediscovered. So the challenge is sometimes those things are incompatible. Sometimes the species that's been brought in has displaced them, and the only way to get rid of the invasive is to active suppression or control programs. So yeah, it's definitely an important one and not an easy one. It's again a collective conversation. Yeah.
I think we're going to take time to have one more question, and I think we're going to delay the start of the next session. Is that right, Warren? Just because I think by 10 minutes, because the conversation is just such a good one right now. So more questions?
Yeah, I'm curious. You talk a lot about how the science feeds into the management bit, and that's assuming that there's a management body that takes that up and actually applies it. But in the real world, the management is very commercial fishery centric, and there's no uptake really. So how do you bridge that gap and avoid economics?
Yeah, again, I think it's the value proposition and the political will, and that means spending time with politicians. It means building a case that rec fishing does need to be taken seriously. It's hard, where do you start? That's the problem. Finding those champions, it may require celebrities, but having a plan. How do we increase the prominence and profile of rec fishing in this given location or region or context so that it's taken seriously? And it takes work, and there's been that kind of work happening. I'm sure many of you in this room have had to do that, in a given jurisdiction. So I don't have a silver bullet there. It's yeah, it's a slow burn.
All right, I think with that, let's give Steve, another big round of applause.